Could be he's already using intelligence services from, I don't know, Turkey or somewhere else, and he's already passing messages. Help me come to power and make me supreme leader, and I will take Iran in a very different direction.
I believe that would be the worst case scenario if they survive, because they're planning for survival, and then the narrative would be success.
There's been so many killings of senior leaders that there's a genuine question to be asked. What is left of the command and control?
The regional chessboard around Iran and the forces shaping the future of a country that sits at the center of one of the most consequential geopolitical questions of our time.
One of the greatest crimes of Ali Khamenei, other than ordering the killing of his own people he killed so many people that he will go down in history as a killer of his own people more than anything else.
The battle of the Ayatollahs in Iran explores internal power struggles within the regime. Many people imagine the Iranian system as a monolith, but you argue it's far more complicated.
Forget this. The US and Israel are not the ones paying the biggest price here. It's the Gulf countries. They are paying hundreds of billions, probably trillions of dollars in terms of all sorts of damages that they're going to incur. Not least is image damage.
In reality, there are clerics, the IRGC, technocrats, ideological hardliners, as you mentioned. Which group actually holds the most power today?
The sequential escalation is something that should not be discounted. We're not there at the point where they are, going suicidal. They're still in the hope that they can survive this.
There is no obvious planning for day after, and no one's seeing that, exist. Do you think that secular government, democratic secular government ambition is achievable based on what we're seeing?
Khamenei is obviously now gone. So it's a question mark whether the supreme leader role and that office that he built can continue to function.
Some analysts argue that Iran is escalating gradually to test limits, almost like probing a defense system. Do you see a deliberate strategy behind the pace of escalation, or just it's another headline?
IRGC is the state within the state, has its own interest, has political power, has economic power, has an intelligence branch, is involved in foreign policy like any other interest group. If the regime survives, Revolutionary Guards are probably, at least in the short term, by far the most capable, organized entity.
I really cannot find an easy answer for that, because such an answer doesn't exist, in my opinion.
Prosperous Iran, a partner, a country that needs billions and trillions in investment, could support investments around it. It could be such a positive economic force for so many countries in that West Asia region. So,
Alex Vatanka, welcome to Beyond the Summit.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be with you.
Thank you so much. You are one of the most respected analysts on Iran's politics and foreign policy, a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute and author of The Battle of the Ayatollahs in Iran. For years, you have studied the power struggles inside the Islamic Republic, the regional chessboard around Iran, and the forces shaping the future of a country that sits at the center of one of the most consequential geopolitical questions of our time. Alex, before we get into geopolitics and strategy, I always like to begin with the human story. You were born in Iran, grew up partly in Europe, and built your career studying Iran from the outside. What early experiences shaped your curiosity about politics and the Middle East?
So, Amir, thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I was born a few years before the 1979 revolution. So I was not part of that generation of Iranians that spent so much time trying to figure out what kind of a political world they wanted to live in. My parents' generation, they spent the 60s and 70s trying to break down the old order. That was the context of the Cold War. Iranian students at the time, whether they were leftists, Islamists, nationalists, ethnic groups, you name it, politics was such a big part of their growing up. That was not my experience because I was too young and I barely remember 1979 revolution. I do remember the protesters, the chants, whether you were supportive of the Shah, you will hold his image up, or if you're supportive of Ayatollah Khamenei. remember that. But what I can tell you for sure is that that revolution and that outcome of that revolution greatly shaped my life, because not just me, all Iranians, millions of us who left, we ended up being impacted on a personal level. So for us, it wasn't just political theories, what kind of a political world we wanted in Iran. We paid with our lives, and essentially the impact on our lives, the consequences. So I ended up leaving Iran and going, as you said, grew up in Europe and then 20 years in the United States. So that leaving Iran the way I had to do with so many others, that is essentially the impact, the main impact of the revolution on my life. And you're right, I've been mostly an outsider looking in because I haven't lived in Iran for 40 years.
Right.
But because I speak the language, I can read between the lines, I get the cultural context, and I've done this professionally now for 25 years. It just gives you a little bit of edge compared to folks who might not speak Persian or might never been there, which is often the times the cases of Americans who watch Iran because of the bad blood between the two countries for about half a century. So that's how I kind of became involved on not just being of Iranian extraction, but also professionally devoting my career to trying to figure out to the extent I can what's going on in that country.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. So you've spent decades analyzing Iran's leadership, ideology, and power structure. What is something about Iran that outsiders, even policymakers, consistently misunderstand?
One of the things that, I mean, here, I want to sort of make it most relevant because you can go in different directions. A question like that. There are a lot of things people misunderstand about countries that are on the other side of the planet. It's not just true for Iran, it's true for many. But here in Washington, D.C., where I've lived and worked for 20 years, one of the arguments you often hear, or at least did until recently, this recent war, is that the Islamist ruling elite in Iran are all the same. They're all the same. There's no difference between them. They're all Messianic Shia Islamists. They have one worldview. They hate the outside world. They hate anybody inside who doesn't like them. And there's no compromise to be had with them. That kind of a black and white worldview, sometimes I'm envious because it makes life easier to understand what's going on. Well, this is how they are. But the reality obviously is not that. There are so many different layers to what's going on inside the Iranian regime. And if people have the patience for it, because I understand you get bored, comparing one kind of Ayatollah with another kind of Ayatollah, one kind of beard with another beard. But trust me when I tell you, those differences actually matter. And the idea that all of them are hardliners or extremists and middle of the road extremists just doesn't capture the differences. And I say that because those differences are actually something that those people and there are plenty, who want to see an end to the Islamic Republic can tap into. So the idea that, the ultra right today in Iran, and I don't want to give people too many names because that can be confusing unless you're Iran watchers, but the idea that Saeed Jalili, extreme right winger in Iran, is the same as, say, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, a typical middle-of-the-road populist, is the same as a Hassan Khomeini or a Mohammad Khatami. I mean, the idea that they're all the same is just intellectually irresponsible. It's beyond lazy. It's not trying to get your head around it. There are no political parties in the Islamic Republic for deliberate reasons that from get-go, they made sure there were no political parties. And by the way, that was something also the Shah did. This is oftentimes what you find in authoritarian systems. No political parties. So what you need to look for instead are personalities and the networks around those personalities. We talk about Khamenei's network. Well, that's very formalized in the Supreme Leader's office. It's kind of obvious. But there are other networks that aren't so obvious. Rafsanjani, who died in 2017, very powerful network that's still, almost 10 years after his death, still there. It's a network. It's not a party political system, doesn't have an agenda, but it's got interests. And I can go on. There are lots of different networks. I wouldn't exaggerate it, but there are at least a dozen or so networks that you can point to and say, well, this one is strong, this one is not so strong, this one is strong in this area, this one is strong in this region. And that, I think, is, when you're covering the same country as long as I have, and those of us who are Iran watchers, what is exciting for us is exactly those minor details that might not make much difference to somebody who just picks up a newspaper and reads. But my job then is to make sure in an accessible way, I say and convince them that little minor detail here actually matters. And I can go on and give you examples, but let me just pause, Amir, and get your reaction.
No, that was very interesting point you mentioned. Your book, The Battle of the Ayatollahs in Iran, explores internal power struggles within the regime. Many people imagine the Iranian system as a monolith, but you argue it's far more complicated. What are the real factions inside the Islamic Republic?
These factions exist. They're real. To my earlier comment, they're part of networks. And when you're in a network, it's not so much that the network has an ideological core that you subscribe to. It might not. Oftentimes it doesn't. You go with it because it's your network. It's where your buddies are. It's where your personal interests are also vested. Let me give you a very clear-cut example. The political left in the Islamic Republic in the 1980s, the likes of Mohammad Khatami and Mir Hossein Mousavi, the Green opposition leader, they were the traditional hard left, very famous for their kind of belief in centralized economic planning, anti-American, kind of very ideological. That same group by the 1990s is what we call today the reformists, what's left of them. Kind of almost all collectively moved from one set of interests to another set of interests. But the point I'm making is they went more or less as a network. They all went together. Even though they started off being to the right of someone like Ali Khamenei, the late supreme leader, they decided that, they felt the country's interests were better served in a different direction. And I would say they learned from their lessons, because during the Iran-Iraq war, they famously were very set in their ways. By the end of that war, they were open enough to admit that the way they've handled the war effort, the economy, Iran's foreign policy, came at a bitter cost for the country of Iran. So they were willing to change course. Let me give you another example, Amir. Ali Khamenei, who became the ultra hardliner, was opponent of these very same people, the reformists in the 80s. He was calling them names. He was the pragmatic one. He was the one who was like, yeah, some of your policies are too excessive. Like, for example, when the United States sold Iran those F-14s in the 70s, it was Khamenei who insisted that they shouldn't return it to the United States, because a lot of the revolutionists after the Shah fled wanted to actually give these planes back. Said, we don't need these expensive planes. We want money for the poor. And Khamenei was one of the key voices, said, no, we need these planes at some point in the future. And turned out he was right. During the Iran-Iraq war, those F-14s did provide a service. So I would say, these networks, they're there. They have been there all along. Other networks have been added over the years. So the first generation revolutionaries, they would be men in their 70s and 80s and older. Most of them are gone. So now we have to sort of put together a picture of the younger generation revolutionaries who came after the fact. They weren't there in 79, but they are still interested in access to money and power. And that's why we've seen a number of new groups emerge to the right, to the left. But overall, I would say politics in Iran is perhaps not as exciting as in the United States, but actually, if you pay attention to the detail, those details matter.
Right. So when people hear the regime, they think of a single unified power structure, quote unquote, so it's more or less similar network. But in reality, there are clerics, the IRGC, technocrats, ideological hardliners, as you mentioned. Which group actually holds the most power today?
No, Khamenei is obviously now gone. So it's a question mark whether the supreme leader role and that office that he built can continue to function the way he has functioned while Khamenei was in charge. Khamenei took 37 years almost to build up that empire. So it's going to be very difficult for whoever comes after to do the same. It will at least take time. And obviously, Iran is in a very different place than in 1989 when Khamenei took over. So I have lots of question marks about the future of the office of the supreme leader. And by the way, I think that's an opportunity for those in the opposition or foreign powers who are looking for ways to shape Iran's trajectory going forward. But the one group that has been very powerful, and largely thanks to Khamenei, who I think will in the short term remain powerful, are the Revolutionary Guards, or the Islamic Revolution Guards Corps, IRGC. IRGC is the state within the state, has its own interests, has political power, has economic power, has an intelligence branch, is involved in foreign policy like any other interest group. And as of right now, although they've been losing a lot of men to the Israeli-American bombing, they're still in this game. They're still fighting on. If the regime survives, Revolutionary Guards are probably, at least in the short term, by far the most capable, organized entity from what I would describe the hardliners in the regime. I would put Khamenei and Revolutionary Guards as hardliners, not ultra hardliners like Paidari and Saeed Jalili faction, but definitely hardliners. And then within the regime, you also have people like Masoud Pezeshkian, the president, the so-called technocratic class. Yeah, so watch out for IRGC.
Thank you. You mentioned current events, specifically the current war. Seeing, the escalation between Iran and Israel and the United States that has reached a level we haven't seen before. From your perspective, what is actually happening right now behind the headlines?
To be honest, and this is an unusual thing for me to say, I think the headlines are capturing pretty much what's happening. U.S. has been engaging Iran militarily with Israel, engaging meaning they're dropping bombs on them. The Iranians are returning the favor, if you will, by pretty much hitting anyone that they can reach. Not everyone, but pretty much anyone they can reach. I feel sorry for the Gulf countries because Iran, those are the easiest targets for the Iranians, and now they're paying the brunt of the price. There is no political agenda in Washington that is convincing to me other than the one regime change, maybe state collapse. I hope that's not the U.S. policy is state collapse in Iran. I know a lot of people say that's what the Israelis want because I was just on a panel a couple of hours ago, and one of the speakers on the panel reminded audience members that Israelis tried to be friends with Iran in the 70s, and they were good friends. But then Iran, after the revolution of 79, turned on Israel. So Israel learned a lesson that doesn't matter who runs Tehran. We just make sure that Iran is weak. And if that becomes the policy, then I think what happens, one, I think is a mistaken policy. Two, you demoralize the opposition to the Islamist rule. Because I think that's one of the things Iranians who are in opposition by and large, and most are, what they want is the end of the Islamic Republic, but they're more or less hoping for a secular democratic system. And I know it sounds like a tall order. How do you get there? But that's what they want. That's the vague notion most people have. A secular democratic system, maybe a republic, maybe a constitutional monarchy. And yeah, that part of it is missing when you look at what the US is saying and doing. So just a few hours ago, Donald Trump now wants to choose the next Iranian supreme leader. I don't know what to make of that statement, but what I can get out of it is there's no serious thinking going on. And I don't want to just say that about Donald Trump because everybody else is saying that about Trump, that he has no game plan, because I don't think that would be unfair. But in this case, he really doesn't seem to have a game plan other than he's going for fragmentation of Iran, which is not his agenda, but could be easy said to be Bibi Netanyahu's agenda. And he has brought him along on this journey. That's, as a policy mission, if you're US, you're Israel, you can maybe justify it. But in the process, you can no longer really depend on the Iranian public's support for you because support for dismantling Iran doesn't exist as the force inside the country. By and large,
So
yeah.
that's the key point. So there is no obvious planning for day after, and no one's seeing that exist. Do you think that secular government, democratic secular government ambition is achievable based on what we are seeing?
If you give it a chance, it would be something you could do. I mean, one of the greatest crimes of Ali Khamenei, other than ordering the killing of his own people he killed so many people that he will go down in history as a killer of his own people more than anything else. One of the things he could have done, he had ample of opportunity, was to sort of be a bit humble when it came to respecting and listening to his own people. Humble in the sense of, when you look at 70% of Iranian society being born in after 1979, having any memory of the Shah, and only having a memory of Khamenei and being angered by Khamenei's policies, Khamenei has had plenty of warnings that this society is upset with you. This society doesn't believe in your worldview. This society wants different things than what you're offering them. They want comfort here, some comfort at least, and not the sanctions and the wars and the belligerence that you stand for. Khamenei never went there. Khamenei, since 97, with the election of Mohammad Khatami, knew 70-80% of Iranian society leans towards major reform. Instead of trying to adapt to that, he did everything he could at every turn to stop it, to stifle it, to sabotage it. Whether it was Mohammad Khatami, whether it was even Mahmoud Ahmadinejad or Rouhani. The only president he got, or I shouldn't say he put on gave the presidency to on a silver platter was Ibrahim Raisi, who was of his
Was
mind
not lucky
disposition.
enough, yeah.
And then he ended up the way he left this world. So I think it's tragic even for the Islamists when you think about it. I mean, if they were just a bit more capable of introspection and of accepting that they are in a very different place than the average Iranians and made the necessary adjustments, then a lot of these people could be alive today and could be religious, pious, whatever you want to call it, get on with their lives instead of forcing their militant Islamist worldview down the throats of people, which basically didn't just upset Iranians, but created this foreign opposition and anger and fear that resulted in the US and Israeli attack on Iran on the 28th of February 2026.
So that's the irony. If there was a tiny bit of rational and logic behind their decisions, so it wouldn't be the situation that we are dealing with right now. So, Alex, some analysts argue that Iran is escalating gradually to test limits, almost like probing a defense system. Do you see a deliberate strategy behind the pace of escalation, or just it's another headline?
Look, there's been so many killings of senior leaders that there's a genuine question to be asked. What is left of the command and control? Now, Iranian officials will tell you they had prepared for this day. They got what they call the mosaic defense strategy, that everybody's got a manual. They know exactly what to do, even if they can't talk to the mothership back in Tehran. They know what to do, when to fire, what to fire, who to fire. I think the sequential escalation is something that should not be discounted. We're not there at the point where they are, going suicidal. Obviously, some of the things they've done, hitting hotels and so forth in the Gulf cities of like Dubai and Doha, this is a sign of desperation. My point is, it could get worse, probably at least in the short term, but they're not throwing everything they have at everyone for now. They're still in the hope that they can survive this. Their fundamental point is that Trump is going to get cold feet. They could easily be wrong on that. And Trump has surprised them repeatedly. And they're still believing that if the region doesn't pressure Trump to walk away, like the Gulf countries, the American public opinion or the Republican Party itself could force him to stand down, and then the regime survives. And then they have to go and figure out what comes next because, as I said, Khamenei was there for 37 years, big shoes to fill, but they have to make a fundamental decision which direction they want to go. Doubling down on the legacy of Khamenei will only get them so much time. They will still be on borrowed time. They could decide to go in a different direction and do what I just suggested they could have done for many years ago, except that the society they are in charge of is not Islamist by nature, is not looking for foreign wars by nature, doesn't really have this obsession with Israel or United States. By and large, it doesn't. Cares about things like everybody else pretty much around the world cares about. When I get up in the morning, something to eat, work to get to, house to have, well-being of my family, and so forth. So that's another way where they could go. Putting nation building, development at home first, and not this, which I think is essentially Khamenei's legacy of his Cold War mentality of fighting what he would, when he was alive, call istikbar or imperialism. So let's see which way if this regime survives. I mean, if it survives, because as we speak here today on early March, there are U.S. officials who are talking about American boots on the ground in Iran. That takes us in a whole different direction.
Exactly. So I believe that would be the worst case scenario if they survive, because they're planning for survival, and then the narrative would be success. We succeeded, against all coalition forces and U.S. and Israel and all their allies, so we succeeded. We know that this has been played before. But right now, the intensity of strikes in the last few days has clearly increased. When conflicts suddenly accelerate like this, what usually drives that shift? Political signaling, military opportunity, or domestic pressure?
So intensification is being concentrated on the regime security forces. We see a lot of effort to sort of clear the way, create a corridor of sorts in the West. If the Kurds do end up coming in from Iraq to take part of Iranian Kurdistan, control it, declare autonomy or independence, who knows, which would be in itself pretty messy, but it's a real prospect of that. But yeah, the U.S. campaign right now, I mean, at some point, they're going to either run low of targets to hit or ammunition to hit. There might be political pressure here that makes it harder for the Trump administration to stay in this war at this intensity. The Israelis will stop, I think, when the Americans stop, unless Israel keeps being hammered by Iranian ballistic missiles, which could happen. But maybe they also decide that if they had hoped the Iranian people will rise up and take their country, as Trump and Netanyahu have been asking for it, if that doesn't happen, then how long are they going to stay in this fight? The Iranians will stop firing back if U.S. and Israel start firing at them, because that takes us to your point. Their regime will survive, which would be ultimately a pretty damn embarrassing strategic defeat for both U.S. and Israel, because they could have done this differently, a much smarter way than damaging so much in the process. And, fundamentally, well, forget this. The U.S. and Israel are not the ones paying the biggest price here. It's the Gulf countries. They are paying hundreds of billions, probably trillions of dollars in terms of all sorts of damages that they're going to incur. Not least is image damage. I mean, you're not supposed to be fearing flying into Gulf airports. They're supposed to be safe and luxurious. So they must be fuming. They must be fuming, and I think I have every right to be fuming, because they didn't ask for this war, because they said from get-go, if you start this war with Iran, Iran cannot reach the United States. Can reach Israel, but it can for sure reach us. And that's exactly what Iran is doing.
Right. So this is where we can say history repeats itself, considering the scenario of Islamic regime survival. Exactly what happened after 91. Saddam, was in Kuwait, and then when he survived, we know what happened after that.
Yeah.
So from the Iranian leadership's perspective, what is the end game in your opinion? Is this about deterrence, survival, or something bigger?
I mean, I think right now, obviously, survival is what gets them up in the morning. But if they survive and they can go back to selling oil and getting whatever money they can get, if it's a decision to double down on Khamenei's legacy and continue going in that direction of rebuilding the missile program, the nuclear program, staying on the same course of fighting, U.S. and Israel, then again, I think they'll be on borrowed time, because we've seen people in Iran keep rising up more frequently than before.
I don't think it would be sustainable, so considering the economy, which is a big deal right now, that was the main cause that this last, uprising started, at least.
Yeah, no, exactly. I agree. It cannot be sustainable. And now Khamenei's dead. There's an opportunity, even if the regime survives, whoever is in charge of the regime, one man or a group of men, interim council or something else, they really have an opportunity to reinvent themselves. They don't have to do what Trump is saying, come out and wave the white flag and capitulate openly. They don't have to do that really in practice, but they need to change course. They need to have different policies, both because that's what the people of Iran want, and obviously that's what U.S., Israel, and Europeans and many others want from this regime.
You mentioned about the latest development that Trump, new opinion about Supreme Leader. So he was keeping distance when he was asked repeatedly about, would you support Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi? And says, okay, so this is not something that we need to talk about, or it's not my place or position to support him or do not. It's Iranian people. What has changed that suddenly he says, I need to play my role in selecting Supreme Leader of Iran? It's very interesting.
It's really difficult. I mean, it could just be something as simple as Donald Trump not understanding the Iranian political setup, not understanding what a supreme leader means, what the job requires, what the process looks like. I mean, Donald Trump right now could declare victory and say, I killed Ali Khamenei, victory declared, I move. But what he's trying to do is regime change, he's saying, but he's actually doing something harder than regime change. Regime change is relatively straightforward because you just have to find opposition defectors and sort of push that agenda for regime change. He's doing something even harder. He wants to be converting the loyalists of Ali Khamenei to MAGA supporters so he can have a say in the selection of the supreme leader. He wants these Shia militants to have him with the veto power. You can't make this stuff up. You really can't make this stuff up. And so that takes me to, I don't think the man knows what he's talking about when it comes to wanting to have a say. I give it this much to Donald Trump. He's not talking about the grand Ayatollah that by constitution has to be someone who takes over. He's talking about he has to have a say. We're a top leader in Iran. And if you look at it that way, it's much more understandable where he's coming from. But if you knew what a supreme leader means in terms of the religious qualifications, you have to go through an assembly of experts, they have to vote for you. Then you have somebody at least should tell him how the Catholic Church chooses its popes, because that gives him an idea what the Iranians do when they choose this supreme leader. If they end up choosing a supreme leader, who knows what they do?
Right. You mentioned, so one of the main victims is these Gulf countries. How worried should we be about this becoming a truly regional war? Because I do not believe it's truly a regional war at this point. How worried should we be?
So I don't know what the definition of a regional war is, but Iran is
that they actively get involved to take part in attacking.
Well, they're
Iran.
not involved in the sense that they're getting drones and missiles thrown at them. So in that sense, they're involved. But you're right that they're not responding in kind yet. I suspect that is a tough decision for them to make. How much could they actually damage Iran? It's a question mark. What difference would it make when US and Israel already in the fight? What could the Bahraini Air Force do that would be so, or the UAE, or that would be so game changing? Probably not. And if they do attack Iran, using offensive tools as opposed to just using interceptors to stop these missiles and drones, then the Iranians will have an excuse to hit them even harder. And they're the closest thing to Iran, right? They're the closest thing to Iran. Anybody who's been to the Gulf knows that Iran is not far away. So I understand why the Gulf countries are playing this very safe. That makes total sense to me. They're obviously hoping that Iran will come to its senses and keep the war between itself and US and Israel. But I doubt Iran will do that, because Iran is fundamentally very weak. And its best bet in many ways is this internationalization of the conflict. So I would not be surprised if more energy infrastructure was hit to the south, trying to create a shock for international economy, maritime, energy trade, you name it. I hate to think of strategic assets on the other side of the Gulf becoming targets, but that's another thing. If US and Israel tomorrow hit, I don't know, Hark Island in Iran, expect the Iranians to find something equally important on the other side to hit. So this could get out of hand very quickly. And in that sense, it's already a regional.
Right. So the fact that Gulf countries are playing safe bet, makes sense in a way that they know they're vulnerable, so,
Right.
and absolutely, and it can get out of hand, so quickly. But the strategy of Iran that they're following to drag out this war in a way to raise the political costs for the United States, specifically for Donald Trump, how long do you think they can, follow this strategy?
I agree with you. That's what Iran wants to do. U.S. is paying what, about $1 billion a day on this war. God knows what the costs are for Americans when if you want to measure this based on the price of gas going up and commodity, all sorts of goods going up in price, because that's, as you know, what happens when oil goes up, everything goes up. So you can measure that. It's runs in the many, many billions, but fundamentally Trump has to balance this, paying a big political price at home, potentially, under pressure for sure already, but has to pay a bigger political price, versus this notion that he seems to subscribe to, him as the savior of the Iranian people and at least of Israel, that he frees the region of the Islamic Republic. And as, let me quote Senator Graham of South Carolina, he becomes the Ronald Reagan of his time. I don't know how Donald Trump in his second term, not worried about re-election anymore, how that sort of versus the risks he would have to take to stay in this fight for the longer term, but maybe the appeal of being the American president who basically topples the Islamic Republic since Jimmy Carter might just be more captivating in his mind for him as his legacy is concerned than a lot of people think is the case.
Right. There is a point that I really cannot find an easy answer for that, because such an answer doesn't exist, in my opinion. While all this is happening externally, Iran itself faces enormous internal pressure, economic hardship, sanctions, protests, and generational change. How stable is the regime internally right now, in a sense that after these, bombing campaign is kind of over, and Americans are signaling Iranian people who protested, in January, it's time for you to get back to your streets, and get institutions, how plausible do you think this strategy is?
So, Amir, I will tell you my estimation on that is that's actually not improbable. That is possible. I don't think that call should come from the United States or Israel. Last time they called Trump and Netanyahu, it didn't really make much of a difference. Fundamentally, it didn't make much of a difference. Of course, some people were encouraged by that, but it didn't really change the trajectory of where we were going. What could make a difference is, and remember, fundamentally, I believe that the future of the place in the short term, long term, in the hands of people who live in Iran. So if there is a split inside what's left of the regime, then I can see that partition, that split in the regime, and calls that might come from one faction saying, let's mobilize against the hardliners who've brought us to this point of disaster, that could be a real mobilizing element. We saw that in 2009. In 2009, it wasn't people in the streets. It was one faction within the system that fell out with another faction, and it was a hugely important mobilizing element. So that, I think, is important because it also gives you an address that you can go to when you are subscribing to this notion that people power in the street can result in change. If you're just doing it because some American president or Israeli prime minister told you go to the street, but you don't have an organized agenda, a network, plan, underground in Iran, what are you doing? You're going out in the streets, you're shouting, chanting, and the security forces will come and shoot you dead. That is not smart politics. You could say, well, the security forces by then have been entirely eliminated. That's different if we get to that, but they're not eliminated as of this conversation right now. And they're very worried about it. And in Iranian state TV, they're saying if anybody wants to come out and protest against the regime, kill them. Basically, that's pretty much explicitly said, kill them because they're traitors. Right. They're foreign agents. But no, that, I think my bottom line is this. The regime is hated by the Iranian people for good reasons, for very good reasons. So that anger is there. Are they willing to risk it for nothing? No. Are they going to be willing to risk it when they see, oh, there's a clear way we can organize? We come out in the street. We have already prepared the ground for defections from the regular armed forces, the Atesh. Maybe even members of the Revolutionary Guards have decided they're going to join. Then this starts to look much more like 1979. This starts much more to look like 1979. You chip away at the old guard, an old regime, and you create an alternative in waiting. But it's really important it's on the ground in Iran. It can't happen in Toronto or in Washington, D.C. You can't have it done here and then put it on a plane and take it. It has to happen there. I'm not saying the opposition outside don't have a role to play. They do. They really do. But it's extremely important that those in Iran are in the driver's seat.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a point that I really like to know your opinion about. So, someone like Hassan Rouhani has been silenced recently after the war, specifically. There was some noise about him and his competition with the supreme leader, for the succession. But right now, quiet. Does it mean anything?
Look, it could mean a lot of things, or it could mean nothing. Hassan Rouhani, we know, is a target inside the country. Inside the Islamic Republic, there are a lot of people who would like to see Hassan Rouhani dead. So he's not necessarily just hiding from American bombs and missiles. He's hiding from people from within the regime who openly on TV are calling him a foreign agent. That's not just Hassan Rouhani, Javad Zarif, Mohammad Ghalibaf, Ali Larijani. The Larijani brothers today are under massive attack by certain circles, being called, hidden Jews, as they call them. That they are basically part of a Jewish conspiracy. I can go on. I can go on, give you lots of lists. This is where we are politically. People have good reasons to fear internal enemies, even within the regime, and foreign enemies. The Israelis, the Americans, they have shown that they have infiltrated Iranian society. So they might have targets and they have an agenda. Certain people would be better not to be there when they try to implement their project. Should be eliminated, gone, out of the way. So the silence, obviously, you mentioned Rouhani specifically, totally understandable. It could be he's already in touch with the Americans. It could be he's already using intelligence services from, Turkey or somewhere else, and he's already passing messages. Help me come to power and make me supreme leader, and I will take Iran in a very different direction. I mean, I could give you scenarios, but clearly, these are all scenarios and speculation on my part. But I would just say one thing. If you look at the 1971, 1981 period, when it was almost Iran was a state of civil war, how bloody the political factional fighting became, I don't expect it's going to be that different. So I expect if the regime collapses and there's a vacuum, there'll be a lot of killing. There'll be a lot of revenge seeking. And it's going to be very slippery, very scary. And I understand people want revenge for the crimes of the Islamic Republic. What we need to be careful about is you don't jeopardize the state, country, because that has to be preserved. That doesn't mean you don't go back and revisit the issue of what kind of political system you want. I think if you're an ethnic minority in Iran, if you're a Sunni or you're a Baluch or a Kurd, you have good reason to want a different political system, including the idea of a federal system. But there's a time and a place for that. And if you're trying to sort of get that done now, at a moment of chaos and instability, I'm not sure if that's the best way for themselves. These groups them have that interest like that, and certainly not for the country as a whole, because it risks that fear that so many Iranians have, the prospect of civil conflict.
Thank you for sharing your opinion. As you mentioned, there are tons of scenarios, but I need to be patient and wait to see which one of those scenarios will come into light. If power were to shift suddenly in Iran, what would that look like?
I really don't know. The best case scenario, I think average Iranians, a secular democratic system, again, either Republican model, constitutional monarchy. Right now, I don't think Reza Pahlavi has an organized game plan inside of Iran. It is a sad thing for me to say, because I would have thought he has the name recognition, the pedigree, and the fact that he has to knock on the White House door to get them to elevate him. It's sad. Reza Pahlavi has lots of things to offer. And I know people don't like him or they love him, but I look at him in terms of practicality. I want to go back to where Reza Pahlavi was a couple of years ago, and I'm just citing what he says. He said the other day on a TV interview, I think it was 60 Minutes, I'm 65 years old, I'm not too old. I don't think he's too old. And he can go back to his original promise of being the transition leader, the manager that helps bring all the different opposition groups under one roof and they go and keep the place together as one for now, get rid of the Islamic Republic, and look for the day after where, again, secular democratic system could be maybe achieved. And people sometimes laugh when they hear you say, oh, secular democracy in Iran, give me a break. And you have to remind them, this year is 120 years ago since Iran had a constitutional revolution. So they've actually achieved it 120 years ago. They got a parliament. They forced the king at the time, a weak king at the time, but nonetheless a king who gave him a constitution, who gave him a parliament. So no, nothing is out of the possible here. But you need to organize. You need to organize. And a lot of Iranian diaspora oppositions are walking around, joining protest movements, waving a flag, which I totally understand. But when you ask them, how are you going to go from this to being in charge of Iran? What's the plan? What's the pathway to you taking over? When you're dealing with people inside of Iran who feel they have to fight to death because they got no alternative. They're either going to survive or they're going to die. How are we in the outside world going to go and take over unless there's a plan? And that part, unfortunately, is missing pretty much across the board. Well, there are exceptions. MEK is very organized, but frankly, I don't think MEK has much support at all. Yeah, organization really does matter.
Absolutely. The point that you mentioned, I cannot put enough emphasis on that. Up to a certain point, it's understandable that Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi doesn't want, to be seen as someone who's appointed by Americans. Makes sense. When things are normal. But right now, when you're witnessing that Iran is being torn apart, in that case, things will be different. Okay, as you mentioned, knocking on the White House and say, okay, I'm ready. Help me, so to be a transition leader, to do something, so this is not a normal situation, but I don't know when that point has come up or not yet.
Yeah. No, I agree.
So there are rumors about succession struggle around the supreme leader that we know it's not rumor. How real are those tensions?
I mean, I don't even know if inside of Iran there's a good sense of what's going on. But there's a succession process likely to happen. They need that for the sake of continuity. They need to give their base hope that not everything's lost. They have to do that while trying not to get assassinated by Israel, who's promised it will kill anyone who wants to take over. So these are extraordinary circumstances. And fundamentally, I'll go back to a point Amir made before, and Mujtaba Khamenei becoming supreme leader. What kind of a change is that? That's no change. That actually points to a darker future for Iran to come. Even a sort of a reformist cleric would at best be good for, I don't know, 20, 30% of Iranian society who might at that point just want to end the war. Vast majority of Iranians clearly are over Islamic Republic. And the idea is a supreme leadership, people might put up with it if there's nothing else, but that is not the first choice on anyone. But in terms of names, we could go down the list of Hassan Khomeinis of this world, Sadiq Larijani's of this world, Ayatollah Mir Bagheri from the Paidari faction. Hassan Rouhani is a candidate himself. Why not? He could do that. Mohammad Khatami. So yeah, there are a number of people that way. But fundamentally, who gets the job is not because of religious qualifications. It's because of politics and who has the political upper hand the day they announce it. It's exactly what happened in 1989. Khamenei became supreme leader because of political expediency, not because he was a religious figure that anybody had any great respect for, because he was seen as the consensus candidate for vast majority of people who at the time had the power. And by the way, Rafsanjani really pushed his candidacy through. He got it wrong. Rafsanjani, history turned out to got that decision badly wrong, but his gamble was he was going to get a weak supreme leader in Khamenei so he could run the place as president. And for a while he did, but then Khamenei decided, he wasn't going to let Rafsanjani have everything. So he pushed back.
I exactly got the same analysis from Afshan Ostawar. I was talking to him the other day. He mentioned Rafsanjani.
Afshan is a great author on Vanguard, his book, and a good friend, by the way. I'm glad.
Shout out to him, fantastic gentleman like yourself.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and Rafsanjani miscalculated in that regard, thought that supreme leader position would be a ceremonial one, and then
Yeah.
presidency would be the main one. But it turned out to be the opposite,
Biggest mistake of his political career. Biggest mistake.
cost his life.
Khamenei turned out to be power hungry in ways that, I mean, most of us would have a hard time thinking, how do you get up every morning just wanting to be micromanaging so much? Why do you care? But he did. And for 36 years plus, he did. The problem is he got almost everything wrong. All his big gambles went wrong. At home, he got it wrong. Abroad, he got it wrong. He was focused on turning a few West Africans from being Sunni Muslim to Shia Muslims. And when they had a couple of converts, they would celebrate. They would announce it loudly on Iranian media. We have converted somebody from Sunni Islam to Shia Islam in Nigeria. And then while they were doing that, millions of existing Shia Muslims in Iran left the faith. And, his policies just did not make sense when you think about it. And I know people who love him and, called him Imam, think he was the best because he was such a strong character, to tell you. He stood up to the Americans, to the Israeli bullies. Yeah, I mean, he did stand up, but there are other ways, smarter ways to stand up. The way he did it, I don't think was smart. I don't think he's as a resistance leader, he just gambled too much and he burned too many bridges and he forgot his own people fundamentally. He forgot his
That's the
own people.
main thing. Yeah.
When they dance the day you get assassinated by foreign bombs and they're dancing, then I don't know. I know I'm not saying everybody danced. There's surely some that mourned too. But those of us who know Iranian society, we know exactly how average Iranians felt. He wasn't going to be missed.
Right. Right. So what we're talking about, the outcome of this conflict, it's kind of speculation and prediction, but based on facts and experiences and history that you are an expert. If this conflict continues escalating, what are the more realistic scenarios? I'm sorry to put you in
No,
that
no, no.
position. I know.
I just know it. I've been answering all sorts of questions the last 1 week, so I'm a little bit out of my, prepared remarks because this is such a fast-moving topic. Where we were this morning is different than now because this morning Trump didn't want to help select the next supreme leader of Iran. So I don't know what the politics of the United States will be. That's going to be a great factor in shaping the will of the regime to fight on, the will of people to defect or stay with the regime. So much of that depends on the outside world. But, a scenario to keep in mind is US and Israel basically at some point decide they've damaged it enough that Iran will not attack or be a danger for another 20, 50 years. And then just pack up and leave, which I think would be a strategic defeat for the United States. It's a horrendous scenario for the people of Iran, and it's not good for the world. So I hope that they will have now the patience it takes to finish something they started. They shouldn't have started the way they started it. There was no need for this war to happen this way. There would have been smarter ways to bring the Islamic Republic down, but they decided on this. I don't know. Maybe they decided to make an example out of Iran, maybe to sort of dangle Iran in front of the rest of the world and say, never, ever stand in our way. I don't know. But the timing to me was definitely a war of choice. And I hope, but now that they've started it, they will go back, think, how do we put this together? And I was hearing, again, Senator Lindsey Graham saying he doesn't believe in the concept that if you break it, you own it. Other words, yeah, you can break it, but who cares about the future of Iran? That's not what he said, to be fair, but roughly that's where he was going. That's up to the Iranian people, which is true. The future of the place is in the hands of the Iranian people. My point is, help them organize because they got 47 years of proving they can get along. And it's the time. This is the moment. If you don't get along, like Trump said, well, then that's their loss. And, whatever you might think of Trump, fundamentally he has a point. It's the people of Iran who put this regime in there in 1979. The Americans didn't bring Khomeini to Iran. I mean, I know there are all sorts of conspiracy theories, but frankly, that's nonsense. Iranians chose Khomeini, then they got Khamenei. Now Khamenei's gone. They have to work harder than ever, and maybe look for friends like US, others, to help them organize, but take the place in a different direction than a failed state. A failed state where any air force from anywhere can just, whenever they feel like it, go and drop bombs over the heads of Iranians. That to me is a nightmare scenario for the people of Iran, and I frankly think for the rest of the Middle East. Iran that's collapsing, a black hole, it's in no one's interest, because the alternative could be a prosperous Iran, a partner, a a country that needs billions and trillions in investment, could support investments around it. It could be such a positive economic force for so many countries in that West Asia region. So
Right. No, these are possible scenarios. But to your point about, Khomeini and conspiracy theories about that, I had a conversation the other day with Eli Lake, a fantastic, journalist. He mentioned, I really like, the way he put it into perspective that Iranians, because of many reasons that we are all aware of, we're ready for a revolution. So in 78, and then kind of fundamental changes, but Khomeini, stole their revolution by lying and fooling people. That's another way of looking at that. You've spent your life studying power, conflict, and political systems. After all these years of observing Iran, geopolitics, and human behavior, what have you learned about freedom?
that I like freedom, that I like to be able to speak up my mind, travel, not worry about what I dress, how I dress, or my wife, my daughter. I do remember those dark early days, 1980s in Iran. I mean, they put a very bad taste in our mouths. Khomeinists who took over and insisted that we had to dress in a certain way and carry ourselves in a certain way. So no, for me, it's on a very personal level. I could give you an elaborate political answer about freedom, what it does, but no, I go to very basic understanding that being left to decide basic things for myself in my life, for me and my family, that's to me freedom. The regime in Tehran under Khomeini and Khamenei never understood that. To this day, they don't understand it. And that essentially became their undoing. That is one of the reasons that they are so much rejected by their own people. This idea of my way or the highway, that you know better. I remember. Let me leave you with this saying. You've heard it, I'm sure. But I think it was a senior. I don't remember his name. Senior cleric was asked, "Sir, people are saying that why do you insist on policies that you say will take us to heaven? They're saying they don't want to go to heaven. They just want to be left alone here on earth." And he was, no, 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 no. They have to. They have to. That's the mission the regime is on. Another thing where I can quote almost verbatim by Khamenei was, "We didn't come here to make life comfortable for you on earth. This is not why Islamic Republic was created. We're not here for economic planning. We're not here to turn Tehran into Dubai." The problem with that is people wanted to turn Tehran into something much better. And if he had listened to them, he might be alive today. But he didn't, because he was on his way and he thought he was untouchable till he wasn't.
Right. Alex, thank you for this thoughtful and powerful conversation. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.